Amongst the infinite expanse of our universe lies an even more infinite expanse of junk. Retired satellites, disused spacecraft, and abandoned stations are just some of the things that litter our upper atmosphere. But what happens to them when they finally run out of fuel or reach the end of their operational life? In today's mini-documentary, we'll take a look at the strange case of the world's most remote graveyards, which exist not here on Earth but way up in orbit around it. You might be wondering if sending stuff into space is literally throwing it away. Well, kind of. There are places like Point Nemo where old satellites are sent to orbit, but there are also other spots which have become known as space cemeteries, where defunct space stations, satellites, and other objects have been left to die in the cold void of space. One of the most well-known of these is the Graveyard Orbit at an altitude of 340 kilometers above the Pacific Ocean between Australia and Chile. As the crow flies, that is. That's because when it comes to getting rid of space junk, location matters. While no country on Earth would want a bunch of space debris falling over their territory, the remote southern Pacific Ocean, known as the oceanic pole of inaccessibility, is so far from everywhere that it's often referred to as the middle of nowhere. And since there's nothing important down there, any satellite intentionally sent to this part of the world will likely remain undisturbed for the rest of time, or rather until it re-enters the atmosphere again. But before that, it'll spend potentially thousands of years drifting through space as part of the growing collection of defunct satellites in the Graveyard Orbit. The first thing you might be wondering is, how did all this stuff get up there? Space travel is uncheap and no one sends useless items into the upper atmosphere just for the hell of it. So each piece of space junk has a story to tell about our relationship with space exploration. The Graveyard Orbit is littered with discarded rocket boosters, bits of satellites, and even entire space stations. It's become the final resting place for many of the machines that have helped us explore space over the past 6 decades. For example, in 2018, the Tiangong-1 space lab built by China became the first large piece of space junk to fall from the sky after being left in a graveyard orbit. It was deliberately placed there when it was decommissioned, but once it ran out of fuel, its orbit began to decay and it eventually fell back to Earth, burning up in the process. Another object resting in the Graveyard Orbit is the European Space Agency's first space station, Skylab, launched in 1973. This station served as a crucial stepping stone towards the construction of the International Space Station, but it too eventually lost altitude and re-entered the atmosphere, crashing into the Indian Ocean. These are just 2 examples of the many machines that have met their end in the Graveyard Orbit. Others include defunct satellites, dead rocket boosters, and parts of spacecraft that have been damaged while in service. Some of these objects were simply left in orbit when they were no longer needed. In other cases, they were intentionally placed in the Graveyard Orbit to avoid them coming back down to Earth where they could cause damage or injury. For example, NASA's Upper Atmosphere Research Satellite was deliberately crashed into the South Pacific in 2011 after it began to lose altitude and pose a risk to people and property on the ground below. Now, you might be thinking this sounds like a pretty irresponsible thing to do, just chucking old satellites and rocket parts into a remote part of space. And you wouldn't be wrong. In fact, it is estimated that there are currently over 128 million objects larger than a mustard seed orbiting our planet. And that's just the ones we know about. To make matters worse, this number is constantly growing as new satellites are launched and older ones are decommissioned. Each year, thousands of pieces of space debris are added to the Graveyard Orbit, and other junkier bits circle our planet. Eventually, this debris will come crashing back down to Earth, posing a serious danger to life down there. But for now, it continues to drift silently through the vacuum of space, a grim reminder of the cost of exploring the unknown. But you might be asking yourself, why not send space junk somewhere else? Like, what about the North Pole or the Arctic Circle? Those areas don't belong to any countries, so why not dump our waste up there? Well, there are actually laws in place that govern where space junk can be disposed of. According to the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which was the first international agreement governing space exploration, any country launching an object into orbit does so at its own risk and is liable for national activities in outer space, including the return of objects launched into outer space. So if a satellite crashes into someone's house, the country that launched it is responsible for cleaning up the mess. Because of this, most countries prefer to keep their space junk within their own borders, or at least over uninhabited areas of the ocean. For example, the United States has several designated space vehicle re-entry zones where it safely returns spent rocket boosters and other objects. The United Kingdom, on the other hand, has a more relaxed approach, allowing space vehicles to re-enter the atmosphere over international waters. However, these guidelines are not legally binding and countries are free to dispose of space junk wherever they please. As a result, the vast majority of defunct satellites end up in the Graveyard Orbit, which is as far from everything as possible. But you might be wondering who exactly owns the Graveyard Orbit, and the answer may surprise you. No one. The Graveyard Orbit is what's known as a common heritage of mankind. This means that it's not owned by any particular country or organization, but rather belongs to everyone and no one at the same time. The idea behind the common heritage of mankind is that outer space should be accessible to all nations and their nationals, regardless of political or geographical boundaries. This principle was enshrined in the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which established that outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, is not subject to national appropriation by claim of sovereignty by means of use or occupation or by any other means. In practice, however, the common heritage of mankind has had limited effect. Most countries still operate as if outer space is simply a new frontier for them to conquer and exploit. The graveyard orbit is a prime example of this. Despite being a common heritage of mankind, it's effectively become a dumping ground for space junk, which is predominantly controlled by wealthy, technologically advanced nations. This raises questions about whether the common heritage of mankind is nothing more than a noble idea or something more tangible. Ultimately, the fate of the graveyard orbit and other areas of outer space will depend on the decisions made by the nations that control them. While the graveyard orbit is the most well-known example of a space cemetery, it's far from the only one. In fact, there are several other areas in outer space where defunct satellites and spacecraft have been left to rust. For example, there's the Molniya graveyard orbit, which is located much farther out than the more familiar graveyard orbit. Objects in this orbit are typically used for military purposes and are often left in place to monitor enemy activity. There's also the Iridium 33 graveyard orbit, which is home to the remains of a communications satellite that was destroyed by a Russian anti-satellite missile test in 2009. This event created a huge amount of space junk and raised tensions between Russia and the United States. And then there's the Galileo 7 graveyard orbit, which contains the remains of an Italian-built navigation satellite that failed to reach its intended altitude in 2005. Each of these space cemeteries tells a unique story about our relationship with outer space and the various ways in which we've used it over the years. The Molniya graveyard orbit, for example, is a reminder of the military uses of outer space and the often forgotten history of the Cold War. Meanwhile, the Iridium 33 graveyard orbit serves as a stark warning of the dangers of anti-satellite weapons and the importance of international cooperation in space. And the Galileo 7 graveyard orbit is a simple but powerful symbol of the risks and challenges of space exploration. It's safe to say that the world's space cemeteries are a somewhat morbid but essential part of our relationship with outer space. They remind us of the incredible feats we've accomplished as well as the risks and challenges that still lie ahead. As we continue to explore and develop new technologies for space travel, it's important to remember the lessons of the past and ensure that we don't repeat the mistakes that led to the creation of these space graveyards. But for now, they stand as silent sentinels in the darkness of outer space, a testament to the incredible journey of humanity's quest to understand the universe. That's all for today's video. What do you think about the world's space cemeteries? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching. If you liked this video, please leave a like and subscribe for more. With your support, we can continue to bring you amazing space content.